Mr. Stevens has here given us 2 volumes of more than ordinary interest, written with a freshness of matter, evincing in a manliness of feeling, both worthy of high consideration. Although in some respects deficient, the work too presents some points of moment to the geographer, to the antiquarian, and more especially to the theologian. Viewed only as one of a class of writings whose direct tendency is to throw a light upon the book of books, it has strong claims upon the attention of all who read. While the vast importance of critical and philological research in dissipating the obscurities and determining the exact sense of the scriptures cannot be too readily conceded, it may be doubted whether the collateral illustration derivable from records of travel be not deserving of at least equal consideration. Certainly the evidence thus afforded, exerting and kindling influence upon the popular imagination, and so taking palpable hold upon the popular understanding, will not fail to become in time a most powerful because easily available instrument in the downfall of unbelief. Infidelity itself has often afforded unwilling and unwitting testimony of the truth. It is surprising to find with what unintentional precision both Gibbon and Volney, among others, have used. For what purpose of description in their accounts of nations and countries? The identical phraseology employed by the inspired writers when foretelling the most improbable events. In this matter, skepticism has been made the root of belief, and the providence of the deity has been no less remarkable in the extent and nature of the means for bringing to light the evidence of its accomplished word than in the working of the accomplishment itself. Of late days, the immense stores of biblical elucidation derivable from the East have been rapidly accumulating in the hands of the student. When the quote-unquote observations of Harmer were given to the public, he had access to few other works than the travels of Chardin, Pocock, Shaw, Mondrell, Pitts, and Darview, with perhaps those of Now and Troilo, and Russell's Natural History of Aleppo. We have now a vast accession to our knowledge of Oriental regions. Intelligent and observing men, impelled by the various motives of Christian zeal, military adventure, and the love of gain and love of science, have made their way often at imminent risk into every land rendered holy by the words of revelation. Through the medium of the pencil, as well as of the pen, we are even familiarly acquainted with the territories of the Bible. Valuable books of Eastern travel are abundant, of which the travels of Neighbor, Meridi, Volney, Porter, Clark, Chateaubriand, Burckhardt, Buckingham, Morier, Seetzen, de la Marte, Laborde, Tournefort, Matten, Maddox, Wilkinson, Arundel, Mangles, Lee, and Hogg, besides those already mentioned, are merely the principal of the extensively known. As we have said, however, the work before us is not to be lightly regarded. Highly agreeable, interesting, and instructive in a general view, it is also, in the connection now adverted to, claims to public attention possessed by no other book of its kind. In an article prepared for this journal some months ago, we have traced the root of Mr. Stevens with a degree of minuteness not desirable now, when the work has been so long in the hands of the public. At this late day, we must be content with saying, briefly, in regard to the earlier portion of the narrative, that arriving at Alexandria in December 1835, he thence passed up the Nile as far as the lower cataracts. One or two passages from this part of the tour may be noted for observation. The annexed speculations in regard to the present city of Alexandria are well worth attention. The present city of Alexandria, even after the dreadful ravages made by the plague last year, is still supposed to have contained more than 50,000 inhabitants and is decidedly growing. It stands outside the delta in the Libyan desert, and as Volney remarks, it is only by the canal which conducts the waters of the Nile into the reservoirs of its time inundation that Alexandria can be considered as connected with Egypt. Founded by the great Alexander to secure his conquests in the east, being the only safe harbor along the coast of Syria or Africa, and possessing peculiar commercial advantages, it soon grew into a giant city. 15 miles in circumference, containing a population of 300,000 citizens, and as many slaves, one magnificent street, 2,000 feet abroad, ran the whole length of the city, from the gate of the sea to the canopy gate, commanding a view at each end of the shipping, either in the Mediterranean or in the Narrate lake, and another of length equal intersected it at right angles. A spacious circus without the canopy gate for chariot races, and on the east a splendid gymnasium more than 600 feet in length, with theaters, baths, and all that could make it a desirable residence for luxurious people. When it fell into the hands of the Saracens, according to the report of the Saracen general to the Caliph Omar, it was impossible to enumerate the variety of its riches and beauties, and it is said to have contained 4,000 palaces, 4,000 baths, 400 theaters or public edifices, 12,000 shops, and 40,000 tributary Jews. From that time, like everything else which falls into the hands of the Mussulman, and it's been going to ruin, and the discovery of its passage to India by the Cape of Good Hope gave the death blow to its commercial greatness. At present, it stands as a phenomenon in the history of a Turkish dominion. It appears once more to be raising its head from the dust. It remains to be seen whether this rises the legitimate and permanent effect of a wise and politic government, combined with natural advantages, or whether the Pacha is not forcing it to an unnatural elevation at the expense, if not upon the ruins of the rest of Egypt. It is almost presumptuous on the threshold of my entrance into Egypt to speculate upon the future condition of this interesting country, but it is clear that the Pacha is determined to build up the city of Alexandria if he can. His fleet is here, his army, his arsenal, and his forts are here, and he has forced and centered here a commerce that was before divided between several places. Rosetta has lost more than two-thirds of its population. Damietta has become a mere nothing, and even Cairo the Grand has become tributary to what is called the regenerated city. Volume 1, pages 21 and 22. We see no presumption in this attempt to speculate upon the future condition of Egypt. Its destinies are matter for the attentive consideration of every reader of the Bible. No words can be more definitive, more utterly free from ambiguity than the prophecies concerning this region. No events could be more wonderful in their nature or more impossible to have been foreseen by the eye of man than the events foretold concerning it. With the earliest ages of the world, its line of monarchs began, and the annihilation of the entire dynasty was predicted during the zenith of the dynasty's power. One of the most lucid of the biblical commentators has justly observed that the very attempt once made by the infidels to show, from the recorded number of its monarchs and the duration of their reigns, that Egypt was a kingdom previously to the Mosaic era of the deluge, places in most striking view the extraordinary character of the prophecies regarding it. During 2,000 years prior to these predictions, Egypt had never been once without a prince of its own. And how oppressive it was its tyranny over Judea and the neighboring nations. It, however, was distinctly foretold that this country of kings should no longer have been one of its own. That it should be laid waste by the hand of strangers, that it should be a base kingdom, the basest of the based, that it should never again exalt itself among its nations, that it should be desolation surrounded by desolation. 2,000 years have now afforded their testimony to the infallibility of the divine word, and the evidence is still accumulative. Quote, its past and present degeneracy bears not a more remote resemblance to the former greatness and pride of its power than the frailty of its mud-walled fabric now bears to the stability of its imperishable pyramids, unquote. But it should be remembered that there are other prophecies concerning it which still await their fulfillment. Quote, the whole earth shall rejoice, and Egypt shall not be their forever base. The Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite it and heal it, he shall return to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. In that day shall Isaac be the third with Egypt and with Syria, even a blessing in the midst of the land. Isa, pages 19 to 25. Verses 19 to 25. In regard to the present degree of political power and importance into which the country has certainly arisen from under Muhammad Ali, an importance unknown for many centuries, the fact, as Mr. Keith observes in his valuable, quote, evidences of prophecy, unquote, may possibly serve, in no distant period, to illustrate the prediction which implies that, however base and degraded it might be throughout many generations, it would, notwithstanding, have strength sufficient to be looked to for aid or protection, even at the time of the restoration of the Jews to Judea, who will seek, quote, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh and trust in the shadow of Egypt, unquote. How emphatically her present feeble prosperity is, after all, but the shadow of the Egypt of pharaohs. We shall leave to the explorer of her pyramids the wander among the tombs of her kings, or the fragments of her Luxor in her Karnak. At Jidde, formerly the capital of Upper Egypt and the largest town on the Nile, Mr. Stevens encountered 2 large boatloads of slaves, probably 500 or 600, collected at Dongola in Sennar. Quote, in the East, unquote, he writes, quote, slavery exists now precisely as it did in the days of the patriarchs. The slave is received in the family of a Turk, in a relation more confidential and respectful than that of the ordinary domestic, and when liberated, which very often happens, stands upon the same footing with a freeman. The curse does not rest upon him forever. He may sit at the same board, dip his hand in the same dish, and, if there are no other impediments, may marry the master's daughter. Unquote. Morier says, in his journey through Persia, quote, the manners of the East, amid all the changes of government and religion, are still the same. They are living impressions from an original mold. At every step, some object, some idiom, some dress, or some custom of common life reminds the traveler of ancient times and confirms above all the beauty, the accuracy, and the propriety of the language of the history of the Bible. Unquote. Sir John Chardin, also in the preface to his travels in Persia, employs similar language. Quote, and the learned, to whom I communicated my design, encouraged me very much by their commendations to proceed in it, and more especially when I informed them that it is not in Asia, as in our Europe, where there are frequent changes, more or less in the form of things, as to habits, buildings, gardens, and the like. In the East they are constant in all things. The habits are of this day in the same manner as the precedent ages, so that one may reasonably believe that in that part of the world the exterior forms of things, as their manners and customs, are the same now as they were 2,000 years since, except in such changes as have been introduced by religion, which are nevertheless very inconsiderable. Unquote. Nor is such striking testimony unsupported. From all sources we derive evidence of the conformity, almost of the identity of the modern with the ancient uses of the East. The steadfast resistance to innovation is a trait remarkably confined to the regions of biblical history, and it should not be doubted will remain in force until it shall have fulfilled all the important purposes of biblical elucidation. Hereafter, when the ends of providence shall be thoroughly answered, it will not fail to give way before the influence of that very word. It has been instrumental in establishing, and the tide of civilization, which has hitherto flowed continuously from the rising to the setting sun, will be driven back with a partial ebb in its original channels. Returning from its cataracts, Mr. Stevens found himself safely in Cairo, where terminated his journeys upon the Nile. He had passed, quote, from Migdol to Syene, even up unto the borders of Ethiopia, unquote. In regard to the faculties, the facilities, comforts, and minor enjoyments of the voyage, he speaks of them in a manner so favorable that among many of our young countrymen will be induced to follow his example. It is an amusement, he says, even ridiculously cheap, and attended with no degree of danger. A boat with 10 men is procured for $30 or $40 a month, fowls for 3 pastries a pair, a sheep for half or 3/4 of $1, and aches for the asking. Quote, you sail under your own country's banner, and when you walk along the river, if the Arabs look particularly black and truculent, you proudly feel that there is safety in its folds. Unquote. We now approach what is by far the most interesting and the most important portion of his tour. Mr. S has resolved to visit Mount Sinai, proceeding thence to the Holy Land. If he should return to Suez and thus cross the desert to El Arik and Gaza, he would be subjected to a quarantine of 14 days on account of the plague in Egypt, and this difficulty might be avoided by striking through the heart of the desert lying between Mount Sinai and the frontier of Palestine. This route was beset with danger, but apart from the matter of avoiding quarantine, it had other strong temptations for the enterprise and enthusiasm of the traveler. Temptations not to be resisted. The route, says Mr. Stevens, was hitherto untraveled, and moreover it lay through a region upon which has long rested and still rests a remarkable curse of the divinity issued through the voices of his prophets. We allude to the land of Idumea, the Edom of the Scriptures. Some English friends who first suggested this route to Mr. Stevens referred him for information concerning it to Keith on the prophecies. Mr. Keith, as our readers are aware, contends for the literal fulfillment of prophecy, and in the treatise in question brings forward a mass of evidence and a world of argument, which we at least are constrained to consider as a whole irrefutable. We look upon the literalness of the understanding of the Bible predictions as an essential feature in prophecy, conceiving minuteness of detail to have been but a portion of the providential plan of the deity for bringing more visibly to light in after ages the evidence of the fulfillment of his word. No general meaning attached to a prediction, no general fulfillment of such prediction could carry to the reason of mankind inferences so unquestionable as its particular and minutely incidental accomplishment. General statements, except in rare instances, are susceptible of misinterpretation or misapplication. Details admit no shadow of ambiguity. That, in many striking cases, the words of a prophet have been brought to pass in every particular of a series of minutiae, whose very meaning was unintelligible before the period of fulfillment, is a truth that few are so utterly stubborn as to deny. We mean to say that in all instances, the most strictly literal interpretation will apply. There is no doubt much unbelief founded upon the obscurity of the prophetic expression, and the question is frequently demanded, wherein lies the use of this obscurity? Why are not the prophecies distinct? These words, it is said, are incoherent, unintelligible, and should be therefore regarded as untrue. That many prophecies are absolutely unintelligible should not be denied. It is a part of their essence that they should be. The obscurity, like the apparently irrelevant detail, has its object in the providence of God. Were the words of inspiration affording insight in the events of futurity, at all times so pointedly clear that he who runs might read, that they would, in many cases, even when fulfilled, afford a rational ground for unbelief in the inspiration of their authors, and consequently in the whole truth of revelation? For it would be supposed that these distinct words, exciting union and emulation among Christians, had thus been merely the means of working out their own accomplishment. It is for this reason that the most of the predictions become intelligible only when viewed from the proper point of observation, the period of fulfillment. Perceiving this, the philosophical thinkers and the Christian will draw no argument from the obscurity against the verity of prophecy, having seen palpably and incontrovertibly fulfilled, even as one of these many wonderful predictions, of whose meaning until the day of accomplishment he could form no conception, and having thoroughly satisfied himself that no human foresight could have been equal to such amount of foreknowledge, he will await in confident expectation that moment certainly to come when the darkness of the veil shall be uplifted from the others. Having expressed our belief in the literal fulfillment of prophecies in all cases, and having just suggested as one reason for the non-prevalence of this belief, the improper point of view from which we are accustomed to regard it, it remains to be seen what were the principal predictions in respect to Idumea. Quote, "From generation to generation it shall lie waste, none shall pass through it forever and ever. But the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it. The owl also and the raven shall dwell in it. And he shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof, and shall be a habitation for dragons and a court for owls. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow, the screech owl shall also rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest, and lay in the hatch, and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, every one with her mate. Seek ye out the book of the Lord and read. No one of these shall fail. None of shall want her mate, for my mouth it hath commanded. And his spirit hath gathered them, and he hath cast the lot for them. And his hand hath divided it unto them by line. They shall possess it forever and ever. From generation to generation shall they dwell therein. Isaiah, verses 5:10 to 17. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth. Ezekiel 7. In regard to such, the passages here quoted are not printed in italics. We must be content with referring to the treatise of Keith already mentioned, wherein the evidences of the fulfillment of the predictions and their most minute particulars are gathered into one view. We may as well, however, present here the substance of his observations respecting the words, quote, "None shall pass through it forever and ever," and, quote, "Thus will I make Mount Seir desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth," unquote. He says that Volney, Burkhardt, and Joliffe, Henniker, and Captains Irby and Mangles adduce a variety of circumstances, all conspiring to prove that Idumea, which was long resorted to every quarter, is so beset on every side with dangers to the traveler that literally none pass through it, that even the Arabs of the neighboring regions, whose home is the desert, and whose occupation is wandering are afraid to enter it, or to conduct any within its borders. He says, too, that amid all this manifold testimony to its truth, there is not in any single instance the most distant allusion to the prediction, that the evidence is unsuspicious and undesigned. A Roman road passed directly through Idumea from Jerusalem to Aqaba, and another from Aqaba to Moab. And when these roads were made at a time long posterior to the date of the predictions, the conception could not have been formed or held credible by man that the period would ever arrive when none should pass through it. Indeed, several hundred years after the date of the prophecy, we are informed by Strabo that the roads actually were in use. The prediction is yet more surprising. He says, when viewed in conjunction with that which implies the road traveler should pass by Idumea, quote, everyone that goeth by shall be astonished, unquote. The routes of the pilgrims from Damascus and from Cairo to Mecca, the one on the east and the other toward the south of Edom, along the whole of its extent go by it, and touch partially on its borders without going through it. Not even, he says, the cases of Seaton and Burckhardt can be urged against the literal fulfillment, although Seaton actually did pass through Idumea, and Burckhardt traversed a considerable portion of it. The former died not long after the completion of his journey, and the latter never recovered from the effects of the hardships endured on the route, dying at Cairo. Quote, neither of them we have given the precise words of Mr. Keith. Quote, lived to return to Europe. I will cut off from Mount Cedar him that passeth out and him that returneth. Strabo mentions that there was a direct road from Petraea to Jericho, of 3 or 4 days' journey. Captains Irving and Mangles were 18 days in reaching it from Jerusalem. They did not pass through Idumea, and they did return. Seaton and Burckhardt did pass through it, and they did not return. The words of the prediction, he elsewhere observes, might well be understood as merely implying that Idumea would cease to be a thoroughfare for the commerce of the nations which adjoined it, and that its highly frequented marts would be forsaken as centers of intercourse and traffic. And easy would have been the task of demonstrating its truth in this limited sense, which skepticism itself ought not to be unwilling to authorize. Here is no doubt much inaccuracy and misunderstanding, and the exact boundaries of ancient Edom are apparently not borne in mind by the commentator. Idumea proper was, strictly speaking, only the mountainous tract of country east of the valley of Algor. The Idumeans, if we rightly apprehend, did not get possession of any portion of the south of Judea until after the exile, and consequently until after their prophecies in question. They then advanced as far as Hebron, where they were arrested by the Maccabees. That, quote, Seaton actually did pass through Idumea, unquote, cannot therefore be asserted, and thus much is in favor of the whole argument of Dr. Keith. While in contradiction to a branch of that argument, the traveler in question, see his own narrative, pursuing his route on the east of the Dead Sea, proceeded no farther in this direction than to Kerak, when he retraced his way, after going from Hebron to Mount Sinai, over the desert eastward of Edom. Neither is it strictly correct that he, quote, died not long after the completion of his journey, unquote. Several years afterward, he was actively employed in Egypt and finally died, not from constitutional injury sustained from any former adventure, but, if we remember, from the effects of the poison administered by his guide in a journey from Mocha into the heart of Arabia. We see no ground either for the statement that Burckhardt owed his death to hardships endured in Idumea, having visited Petraea and crossed the western desert of Egypt in the year 1812, we find him 4 years afterwards sufficiently well at Mount Sinai. He did not die until the close of 1817, and then of a diarrhea brought about by the imprudent use of cold water. But let us dismiss these and some other instances of misstatement. You should not be a matter of surprise, that perceiving, as he no doubt did, the object of the circumstantiality of prophecy, clearly seen on how many wonderful cases its minutiae has been fulfilled, and withal being thoroughly imbued with a love of truth, and with that zeal which is becoming in a Christian, Dr. Keith should have plunged somewhat hastily or blindly into these inquiries, and pushed to a more improper extent the principle for which he contended. It should be observed that the passage cited just above in regard to Seetzen and Burckhardt is given in a footnote and has the appearance of an afterthought, about whose propriety his author did not feel perfectly content. It is certainly very difficult to reconcile the literal fulfillment of the prophecy with an acknowledgement militating so violently against it as we find in his own words. Seetzen actually did pass through Idumea, and Burckhardt traveled through a considerable portion of it, unquote. And what we are told subsequently in respect to Irving and Mangles and Seetzen and Burckhardt, that those did not pass through Idumea and did return, well, these did pass through it and did not return. Where a passage from Ezekiel is brought to sustain collaterally a passage from Isaiah is not certainly in the spirit of literal investigation, partaking somewhat of an equivoque. But in regard to the possibility of the actual passage through Edom, we might now consider all ambiguity an end, could we suffer ourselves to adopt the opinion of Mr. Stevens, that he himself at length traversed the disputed region. What we have said already, however, respecting the proper boundaries of that Idumea to which the prophecies have allusion, we will assure the reader that we cannot entertain this idea. It will be clearly seen that he did not pass through the Edom of Ezekiel. That he might have done so, however, is sufficiently evident. The indomitable perseverance which bore him up amid the hardships and dangers of the route actually traversed, which would beyond doubt have sufficed to ensure him a successful passage through Idumea the proper. And this we say maintaining still an unhesitating belief in the literal understanding of the prophecies. It is essential, however, that these prophecies be literally rendered. And it is a matter for regret as well as surprise that Dr. Keith should have failed to determine so important a point as the exactness or falsity of the version of his text. This we will now briefly examine. For an eternity of eternities there shall not be anyone moving about it. The literal meaning is in it, not through it. The participle refers to one moving to and fro or up and down, and it's the same term which rendered quote-unquote current as an epithet of money in Genesis 16. The prophet means that there shall be no marks of life in the land, no living being there, no one moving up and down in it, and are, of course, to be taken with the usual allowance for that hyperbole, which is the main feature and indeed the genius of the language. And I will give Mount Seir for utter desolation, and will cut off from him that passeth and repasseth therein. The reference here is the same as in the previous passage, and the inhabitants of the land are alluded to about moving therein, and actively employed in the business of life. The meaning of quote-unquote passing and repassing is sanctioned in Chesenius, Volume 2, page 570, Leo's Trans, compare Zechariah 14 and 8. There's something analogous in the Hebrew-Greek phrase occurring in Acts 28. And he was with them in Jerusalem, coming in and going out. The Latin versatus est conveys this meaning precisely, which is that Saul, the new convert, was on intimate terms with his true believers in Jerusalem, moving about among us, them to and fro, or in and out. It is plain, therefore, that the words of the prophets, in both cases, and when literally construed, intend only to predict the general desolation and abandonment of the land. Indeed, it should be taken into consideration that a strict prohibition on the part of the deity of an entrance into or passage through Idumea would have effectually cut off from mankind all evidence of this prior sentence of desolation and abandonment. The prediction itself being thus rendered a dead letter. When viewed in regard to its ulterior and most important purpose, the dissemination of the faith. Mr. Stevens was strongly dissuaded from design it. Almost the only person who encouraged him was Mr. Glidden, our consul, and but for him the idea would have been abandoned. The dangers indeed were many, and the difficulties more. By good fortune, the Sheikh of Aqaba was then at Cairo. The great yearly caravan of pilgrims from Mecca was assembling beneath the walls, and he had been summoned by the Pacha to escort and protect them through the desert as far as Aqaba. He was the chief of the powerful tribe of Bedouins, maintaining in all its vigor the independence of their race, and bidding defiance to the Pacha while they yielded him such obedience as comported with their own immediate interess. With this potentate, our traveler entered into negotiation. The precise service required of him was to conduct Mr. Stevens from Aqaba to Hebron, through the land of Edom, diverging to visit the excavated city of Petraea, a journey of about 10 days. A very indefinite arrangement was at length made. Mr. Stevens, after visiting Mount Sinai, was to repair to Aqaba, where he would meet the escort of the Bedouin, with a view to protection on his way from Cairo to the Holy Mountain. The latter gave him his signet, which he told him would be respected by all Arabs on the route.